With Planet Zoo's release, finally the highly anticipated full roster of animals has been revealed. Since the game's announcement in April, the community, and especially myself, have attempted to predict the roster for some time. These include my biomes videos where I've gone through an extensive predictions and wish list and tried to guess the likeliness of various common zoo animals. So let's take a look and review the final release roster of Planet Zoo in alphabetical order and look back on how well some of the predictions were and reminisce on some personally expected animals that have been ultimately left out. As a side note, invertebrates and amphibians do not have any predictions associated since there were no predictions video for them in the first place. The Aardvark was revealed in late August during a time when it seemed smaller ground-dwelling mammals such as rodents, marsupials or other burrowing mammals were starting to seem less and less likely. I was pleasantly surprised by the Aardvark. Despite having it as a likely addition, I felt an inkling that animals of this nature were not considered. But with its reveal, I was hoping it would push on for representation for animals such as pangolins and anteaters. This was a highly anticipated species. Despite its rarity in captivity, it was publicly popular and almost considered a stalwart in other zoo game rosters. It's nice to see a large bovine species that is fairly unique in its niche on the African savanna to be represented. One of the first revealed animals is no doubt not surprising for anyone. Although it is less common in captivity than the Asian elephant, it probably evokes much grander and majestic sentiments from the animal-loving community. It's essentially an automatic species of any zoo game roster ever. It took a while for another canid to be announced since the grey/timberwolf reveal during the first announcement trailer for the game, but the expected African wild dog is a stalwart in previous zoo games, in captivity worldwide, and with a surging popularity due to awareness about its conservation. It was expected a giant tortoise would make the game, so I had the Aldabra and the Galapagos as interchangeable. Both giant tortoises ended up making the cut, which is not super surprising, but I felt the slot reserved for the Aldabra in particular could have been used for a more unique land tortoise such as the African spurred or radiated tortoise. The Amazonian giant centipede is one of the largest centipedes in the world and a ferocious carnivore. With potent venom and overwhelming strength, it can overpower animals much larger than itself. It has been chosen as the centipede flagship. One of the first animals on my personal wish list was the American bison in my grasslands video, the first of my biome speculations. American bison represent unique bovine species that are adapted to cooler climates and more open terrains compared to the more tropical bovines such as the African buffalo. As an expectation, it was revealed in data mining late into pre-release period, but alas has been a welcome confirmation. When the game was announced, a camel was mentioned in secondary media, and the Bactrian Camel was the prime candidate. Although less common in captivity with the hugely abundant dromedary, its larger size, thick seasonal fur and double hump made it a far more exotic and preferential camel species, and no doubt fulfilling its expected chances. In my tropical rainforest biome video, I made the ambitious prediction that 2 tapir species would make the game. The expected Malayan and likely addition for one of the 3 South American tapirs. Well, only one has made it into the game, and it is the Baird's tapir. I preferred the Malayan for its obvious 2-tone fur coat, but the Baird's is also a favourite from Zoo Tycoon 2 that will still be highly enjoyable. The Bengal was always my first and foremost favourite for the primary representative of the tiger. It took a while for this species to be confirmed, even though tigers were mentioned to be in the game since announcement. The Bengal was officially crowned to be the flagship species on World Tiger Day in late July. Wildebeest were deduced in the announcement art, but it took until the E3 gameplay demo to clarify the particular species as the black wildebeest. A slight surprise here, I would have preferred the common or the blue wildebeest as they are the more iconic savanna varieties, but I guess the more developed horns help the subsequent chosen species. Nevertheless, it's better than having no wildebeest at all. The first snake to be announced, the boa constrictor, was already confirmed before my terrarium snakes video. In retrospect, I would have put it as a likely but not an expected species because it is still a fairly famous boa variety. The Bongo Antelope of the African tropical rainforest are among the most distinct antelope varieties in the world, with a predicted likely chance of inclusion. Nothing really to say here, but a really nice addition to variety, particularly as many other antelope species are associated with the savanna, so we needed something to spice up the biodiversity. A bit more of an outsider inclusion because I believe there was already strong overlap with chimpanzees. It seems Frontier heavily considered completing the Great Apes lineup for their final roster. I think this is a much more of a post-release DLC variety animal and would have preferred its roster slot given to a more deserving primate such as baboons, gibbons, siamang or the proboscis monkey. Of course, one of the highly expected primate species was the orangutan, the Bornean of which is the largest in this genus, but I had a slight personal preference for the Sumatran variety due to its more critical wild population, although that's rather insignificant and I'm happy to see any orangutan in the roster. Desirable as a captive specimen for its size, colouring and docility, the Brazilian salmon pink tarantula is one of the 3 tarantula species in the release roster. The Brazilian wandering spider was confirmed very early on after media outlets mentioned the animal as one of the world's most venomous but rather obscure spiders. It is an understandable first choice. As an iconic savanna animal and a flagship specimen for many zoos, the cheetah is one of the most expected species for Planet Zoo and therefore no surprise to be in the game. The only mammal I did not predict, the Chinese pangolin, is overall a puzzling choice for me because it is usually outshone by the giant pangolin, a species I had as a possibility, but critical endangerment due to ongoing poaching for its lucrative meat and medicinal uses perhaps may justify its inclusion. I had the deaf adders as a possibility because they are famous venomous snakes but would be overshadowed by other more venomous or potentially more renowned snakes in general, and it's interesting for it to be considered before some others. Revealed in Frontier's second round of announcements at Gamescom, the common ostrich was expected from the beginning and pleasing to see it in the game. Despite not being amazingly popular in the community, the common warthog's prevalence in captivity and in other zoo games makes it another fulfilled personal expectation. The eastern brown snake, despite being the second most venomous land snake after the inland taipan, is extremely famous for causing the most deaths. Probably the most famous snake coming from Australia, so an expected inclusion is warranted. It's interesting why Frontier decided to delve into the specific Taiwanese subspecies rather than just the general Asiatic black bear, but regardless, I predicted the Asiatic black bear as a dark horse expected species despite nobody else really considering them. The uniqueness of their moon-shaped chest and representation as an Asian bear species I thought was enough, and it's welcome to see it being realized in game. As I explained earlier, this was an expected species along with the Aldabra as interchangeable together, with a very slight preference to this particular tortoise on an individual basis, but both have been eventually included, so no real qualms here. Another early deduced animal due to its presence in promotional media, Gemsbok are iconic desert antelope, and it was felt a representation was needed from the oryx genus. Whether this or say the scimitar horned oryx, which is considered changeable. Regardless, the striking horns of the Gemsbok will be welcomed by all. Gharials are extremely unique crocodilians, but their relative obscurity compared to well-known crocodiles or alligators could have hampered their chances. I predicted it as a likely candidate in the hopes Frontier would promote some biodiversity in this animal group and content with their final decision to include the animal. The world's heaviest cockroach, not much really to say here. The giant desert hairy scorpion is North America's largest scorpion species and is extremely prevalent as a pet or in captive showcase. Again, another extremity giganteum candidate, the giant forest scorpion of India and Sri Lanka is the largest scorpion in the world. Possibly the most sought after flagship zoo species in the world, there was almost zero doubt the giant panda would make it into the game, almost because it took until the final release day for it to be fully confirmed. The only gastropod on the roster so far, the giant African snail is notable on account of it being the largest land snail in the world. With Frontier's preferences to include animals that are the largest in their respective groups, it's of no real surprise. The gear monster is probably the most expected lizard due to its popularity across the community, and thus no surprise to see it introduced. However, it is the only non-iguana lizard included. The final animal announced in the pre-release period, the golden poison frog, is an adept addition from the poison dart frog family, although there definitely are more prominent choices. An extremely large beetle, it is also ornately decorated and serves as prize assets in insectariums, but otherwise I don't have much of an opinion here. Bird-eating spiders are some of the most iconic tarantula varieties and make for lucrative assets in zoos due to their large size and hairy legs, producing an intimidating appearance. The Goliath bird-eater is the largest spider in the world by size, so it's another extremity that Frontier has decided to adopt. The other large-sized family of the huntsman spiders are also great alternatives. Once again, the Goliath frog is the largest frog in the world, which has again justified its inclusion as an extremity member for the amphibians. It is however endangered and thus has more of a conservation spotlight than perhaps other frogs as well. It's no surprise to see the greater flamingo as the representative of this group. As the most abundant and largest species of flamingo, it's the premier example, even though there were strong cases for the Andean or Chilean flamingos. The green iguana is one of 2 iguana species confirmed as an exhibit animal, and again it's no real surprise because it is the specimen most associated to represent the iguanas. The iconic grizzly bear is one of the quintessential inclusions when people think zoo games, and was another animal confirmed in the first trailer. It would have been nice to also have the American black bear as a smaller secondary specimen, but I guess that niche is kind of filled by the Asiatic black bear. This is the most surprising addition for me on this roster for several reasons. Firstly, I felt that a singular brown bear subspecies was enough, and that was covered by the grizzly bear. Furthermore, there were plenty of other more interesting and unique bear choices that were available, such as the spectacled or sloth bear. It was therefore my reasoning to consider the Himalayan brown bear unlikely, interchangeable with the Syrian brown bear, and can only feel slightly disappointed with this addition. Another confirmation from the announcement trailer, hippos are another iconic African animal with no arguments on its inclusion into Planet Zoo. The Asian elephant appears much more readily in captivity than the African elephant, so it is actually more of an iconic zoo animal than the latter, and it is nevertheless expected. Frontier has decided to go with the Indian subspecies, the most recognizable flagship member of this species. Although perhaps not a prestigious inclusion, the Indian peafowl is definitely not a controversial choice by any means. I would consider it more of a safe bet, offering a smaller, less significant species to offer as a cheaper and spammable animal. Even though I had this species as likely, it was under the assumption that one of the other African rhinoceros would make the cut first. The Indian rhinoceros is still an amazing choice for variety, but without any of the other 2, I can only feel disappointed that this was the preferred specimen. A slightly surprising addition, the Japanese macaques are by no means iconic zoo animals, and although they are relatively famous, this is another animal I felt has taken the slot of a more deserving primate. Perhaps this animal was added to take advantage of the limited Japanese architectural pieces, but maybe a Japanese themed DLC would seem more appropriate for this type of animal. The largest and most famous monitor lizard is a surefire inclusion on the roster, which I had expected from the beginning. As exotic as it is formidable, Komodo Dragons provide a strong incentive for the deluxe edition purchase. The first frog confirmed for the game is a very obscure candidate from the poison dart family. It's definitely a frog most would have overlooked on any potential predictions list, but perhaps it is justified by its tantalizingly critical conservation status. Although a comparatively less well-known iguana species, its critical conservation status is perhaps the main reasoning of its inclusion, but I can't help to feel a more deserving lizard or even reptilian candidates were overlooked. Mandrills are a pleasing addition, known as one of the most ornately decorated monkeys. These are one of the more appreciated primates, so they are of no surprise. Another tarantula for the books, the Mexican red knee is known for its peaceful temperament as a docile pet. Its striking red coloration on the knees is a highlight of its aesthetic. Behind the Komodo dragon, the Nile Monitor is traditionally the second most famous monitor lizard, and was likely to grace the game as its large size warrants it as a decent open enclosure animal. The Nyala is a very surprising candidate, as it is in fact a species of the Tragelaphus genus that includes kudus and the confirmed bongo. I had the mountain Nyala as a distant, unlikely candidate, but the lowland Nyala that has been confirmed here should really be replaced by a better grassland antelope such as the blackbuck. Another expected addition is the okapi, a unique rainforest herbivore known as the forest giraffes. Their threatened conservation status and mysteriousness have made them awe-inspiring showcases in zoos around the world, and one of the more spectacular animals on this roster. It was great to see it confirmed. The plain zebra is a quintessential African savanna animal that was also one of the first revealed animals, and again, not much needs to be said here because it's considered too much of a core zoo specimen to be left out. As North America's most productive grassland herding animal, equivalent to zebras or other antelopes on the African plains, I considered the pronghorn as a likely candidate, even though it may seem bland to other community members. Not my first choice for a viper species, but the puff adder is still one of the more famous and abundant captive viper snake showcases, so it's an agreeable decision. Definitively outclassed by the common hippopotamus, pygmy hippos appear more readily in zoos because of their smaller size and agreeable temperament. As a result, it is considered a likely inclusion. Eventually revealed as a component of the deluxe edition, it's probably a weaker choice there. Another expected arrival to the roster, the red panda was confirmed on its own respective International Day of Recognition. Red pandas will prove to be a popular animal in the game. The red Rough Lima has been chosen as a secondary lemur species to accompany the ring-tailed lemur. I rated the cockerel cephaka and injury as likelier than this species, but nonetheless am reasonably happy this decision has been chosen as the animal is unique. One of the first animals confirmed and also an iconic zoo animal, the reticulated giraffe is a core mainstay of the roster. Lemurs are popular animals, the ring-tailed even doubly more so. As a result, the ring-tailed lemur deserves its place as one of the first animals revealed and the flagship species of all lemurs. Due to their large size and well-developed horns, Sable Antelopes are remarkable creatures, but perhaps not an iconic savanna animal, and thus considered only likely rather than expected. It is, however, still pleasing to see it introduced into the game. The largest and most infamous crocodile on Earth, the saltwater crocodile, was my frontrunner to be flagship crocodilian, and was pleased to see it to be the first to be confirmed. I had always envisioned the game to include 2 tigers on release. Possible candidates could have included the Sumatran tiger, which is the most common tiger in captivity, but Frontier's choice to include the Siberian tiger is well reasoned as it adds a temperate biome tiger for variety. It's also my favourite tiger variety. Snow leopards are part of the big 5 Panthera cats, and thus is another huge expectation. As one of the few alpine adapted cats and one particular suited to snowy environments year round, snow leopards offer a worthwhile cat species to enhance the roster's biodiversity. As a quintessential African savanna species, spotted hyenas were expected. Ambiguously hinted at in some cryptic tweets in July, it's taken them all the way until release for them to be officially confirmed. The Springboks addition to the roster is kinda perplexing, as it is by no means a core component of the African savanna. It is less recognizable than other antelopes such as impala or kudu, so for me this is an okay addition for variety but not an amazing one. On the other hand, the Thompson's gazelle is synonymous with the African savanna, usually associated with interspecies herds with wildebeest and zebra. It was an expectation of mine since announcement, and it may have been deduced already with the early promotion roster. Despite this, it is probably the weakest candidate on the deluxe edition roster. Confirmed during announcement, the timber or grey wolf is the flagship canid, and rightfully so, as it is the most abundant, widespread, and successful wild canid on Earth. The Titan beetle continues Frontier's preferences for gigantic specimens. Some other and probably better beetle specimens include the Hercules beetle. Of course, the king of the jungle, or more accurately, the king of the savannah, has to make an appearance in the zoo game, and rightfully one of the first animals to be confirmed. The West African Senegalensis clade is one of the more critical African lion populations and has lost 99% of its former range, so it has been preferred to other lion clades and populations. A stalwart in zoos, and as humanity's closest living relative, chimpanzees were destined to be in the game. The western subspecies has been selected for being the most critically endangered and presents itself as a strong argument for its preference over other subspecies. This was an expected addition since the diamondbacks are by far the most famous of the rattlesnake vipers, with the western variety prevalent over a large range and responsible for many deaths in North America. Gorillas were mentioned by media outlets before the western lowland was officially unveiled at the beginning of the Planet Zoo beta period. As the major gorilla population kept in captivity, it makes sense for this subspecies to be the prime candidate. A forgettable inclusion to the exhibit snakes roster, yellow anacondas were probably only considered for their large size. Definitely plenty of better snake considerations out there, but probably won't cause much of a fuss anyway since exhibit animal choices will be less contentious overall. That's the full list of animals in the release roster of Planet Zoo. Overall, it's a fairly strong list, but it is missing some keystone animals. The roster seems very African-centric with strong representation for African savanna and rainforest animals, whilst regions such as South America and Australia are virtually overlooked. Particularly, I had many expected animals on my predictions and wishlist videos that didn't make the cut. Let's explore the animals that I considered expected, but were left out. The addax is a critically endangered desert-dwelling antelope that I thought deserved a roster slot over other antelope varieties. Considering that only the Gemsbok is currently in game as a desert herding antelope, the addax could have provided a possible interspecies relationship. The addax over say the Nyala would have pushed more biodiversity instead of the latter being essentially a copy-paste of the bongo. The Arctic fox was my shout for the most likely fox species to be considered due to its unique environment and fur coat, though it seems no animals from polar regions were considered anyway. It could be a future addition to an Arctic DLC. The exclusion of the bald eagle, despite its status as an expected icon, is understandable, as the species perhaps lends itself more appropriate to an aviary DLC. A surprising lack of any caprines in this game see goats, sheep, and all their relatives all excluded. Of particular note is the iconic Bighorn Sheep, a stalwart in alpine exhibits in zoos. Personally, a rather ambitious expectation, California sea lions would admittedly be more appropriate in a marine DLC. The entire deer family is lacking in the roster. An unfortunate casualty is the widely expected caribou or reindeer. It's looking likely this will be considered instead in an Arctic DLC. Probably the most famous feline outside the big five cats, so a disappointing exclusion for the clouded leopard. Compared to the big cats however, it's more easy to package this animal as a DLC. Cougars are another major cat species outside the big five cats. The mountain lions are ever present in captivity and in other zoo games, so a very perplexing exclusion personally. 0 penguins are part of the base roster and has resulted in major disappointment among the community. Maybe penguins will be paired in an aquatic DLC, but even that is a fairly major stretch considering they are more of a zoo animal rather than an aquarium animal. The nimble fennec fox of the Sahara was very sought after for a spot on the release, especially as a smaller, socially active canid variety from a desert environment. A fairly unique animal that had a strong case for inclusion in the game. When you consider the roster was able to accommodate animals such as the Chinese pangolin, it is a bit disheartening to not consider the giant anteater. Ibexes would have been prime candidates for the flagship caprines, and considering their prevalence in zoos, it's another questionable exclusion. The famous big cat coming from South America is unfortunately not part of the game. In fact, there is a huge lack of any South American animals altogether, which increases the speculation for an Amazonian theme DLC which may include the giant anteater. However, it is a clear disappointment because there are many indications of jaguar themed decorations in the game. It was very disappointing to not see a leopard into the game, and even more confusing since many outlets including PC Gamer had even mentioned leopards in promotional articles. Leopards are one of the more common zoological big cats, and the lack thereof is extremely questionable. Personally, I would have even sacrificed the extra Siberian tiger to replace with the African leopard instead. A less disappointing exclusion, since llamas are domesticated and aren't too high priority, all things considered, it's another alpine artiodactyl that has been excluded in a roster without any alpine artiodactyls. As I said before, the Malayan was my preferred tapir variety, but any tapir inclusion essentially makes this expectation meaningless, though it still would have been nice to see this species introduced in a future DLC. Another unique and exciting caprinae that again has suffered from the roster's lack of consideration for alpine artiodactyls. One of the more disappointing exclusions is the community favourite meerkats. It is felt that the strong focus of the roster on the African savanna was enough to warrant the meerkats as well, and seeing how the final roster unfolded, it made it all the more confusing. The moose is another casualty from the lack of cervine deers on the roster. It's not a majorly controversial exclusion, but it is still a disappointing one. Another big name excluded is the polar bear. Considering the audacity to introduce the Himalayan brown bear, with its niche already covered by the grizzly bear, the largest bear in the world will have to wait for its time in the sun, possibly combined in some Arctic DLC. A horse variety to provide grassland biodiversity, especially since this animal is conservationally important. The Przewalski's wild horse, however, makes a lot of sense for future DLC. The lack of this expected animal means that the only Australian animals included in the game are reptiles, and this exclusion just screams out for an Australian themed DLC. Expect the red kangaroo to be paired with the emu and koala in a possible future DLC pack. Both African rhinoceros, despite a multitude of subtle references that made the community hopeful, were ultimately excluded. Very disappointing considering the roster was very much dominated by the African savanna theme. In conclusion, the roster is still very strong and will satisfy mostly everyone for the foreseeable future until DLC arises. Despite this, the exclusion of some key expected species in the base roster still has to be said, a slight disappointment that really could have made the roster all the more special. 8 out of 10. So this has been my review of the release Planet Zoo roster. What do you guys think about this list? Has there been inclusions that have surprised you and exclusions that have disappointed you? Hope you guys enjoyed the video, like and subscribe for more future Planet Zoo content. Catch you guys later.